call was organized by the 4 scientists who are stepping forward today to express their concerns. And before we introduce them individually, I want to bring the operator on to explain how the Q&A period will work in the latter portion of the call. Operator?
During the question and answer session, you may ask a question by pressing star then 1 on your touch-tone phone. If you would like to remove yourself from the queue, you may press star then 2. Again, it's star then 1 to ask a question.
Thank you, operator. And we're going to repeat those instructions about how members of the news media can pose questions at the beginning of the Q&A period. As I mentioned, you'll be hearing from 4 speakers today. First, Mark T. Swager, Ph.D., Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Rochester Medical Center. Second, Oliver Grundmann, Ph.D., Clinical Associate Professor, College of Pharmacy at the University of Florida. Paula N. Brown, Ph.D., Director of Applied Research, BC Institute of Technology, Canada Research Chair, Phytoanalytics, and Adjunct Professor of Biology at the University of British Columbia. And fourth and finally, Dr. Jack Henfield, Vice President of Research, Health Policy, and Abuse Liability at Pinney Associates, and Adjunct Professor of Behavioral Biology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. So, let's begin with our first speaker, Mark T. Swager, Ph.D., Associate Professor of Psychiatry, University of Rochester Medical Center. Go ahead.
Thank you. On behalf of my son, I'm joining 3 of my colleagues. These are some of the world's leading kratom researchers for this news event, and we have neither been offered nor received any compensation for this. We're deeply concerned by the ongoing advisories and other statements from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration dating back to November that have created unnecessary controversy around the natural botanical kratom. The 4 of us are urging the FDA to cease its scientifically unsupported statements about kratom because we believe that science matters. As you will hear, and this is contrary to public advisories and subsequent warnings issued by the FDA, the mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine compounds found in kratom relative to classical opioids are not dangerously addictive. Moreover, these compounds, unlike opioids, do not pose the health risks, including death, postulated by the FDA. To the contrary, a de facto ban on kratom could result in a serious public health threat as consumers are pushed to dangerous alternatives in the black market. A ban would hinder research, closing off discovery of the potential for kratom in terms of opioid addiction relief and pain management. Instead of the inappropriate scheduling of kratom, as though it were heroin or a similar narcotic, we're urging the promotion of good manufacturing practices, complying to FDA standards, as is the case with other widely available supplements in the United States. The existing science indicates that many millions of people in the U.S. who use kratom rely on it as a lifeline away from potentially deadly opioids. People use kratom to ease opioid withdrawal and to manage acute and chronic pain. Scheduling kratom would remove a valuable pain treatment option for millions, leading to greater opioid use, with the likely consequences of increasing dangerous opioid dependence and overdose deaths. Our objection to the scheduling of kratom is supported by data from 4 national scientific surveys conducted in the past 2 years, as well as decades of information from Southeastern Asia, where this plant has been used widely as a safer alternative to opioids for more than a century. At this juncture, there's no high-quality evidence to indicate that kratom is a serious public health threat, and there's much evidence to suggest that banning it would be. If the government fails to seriously consider the potential unintended consequences of banning kratom, they'll be abdicating their duty to protect the safety of consumers, the express purpose of the enactment of the Controlled Substances Act by the U.S. Congress. Neglecting the available science and scheduling kratom is exactly what one would do if their aim was to worsen the opioid crisis.
All right, thank you. And again, that was Mark T. Swager, Ph.D., Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Rochester Medical Center. Let's proceed to our second speaker, Oliver Grundmann, Ph.D., Clinical Associate Professor, College of Pharmacy, University of Florida. Go ahead.
Thank you. and welcome everybody. Together with my colleagues here and many others around the country and around the world over the last years, Kratom has gained a lot of attention. But even before it gained attention, it has been used widely, both as a dietary supplement and as a traditional medicine in Southeast Asia and in the other countries. The FDA has undertaken by itself only a limited number of studies, among them a computer simulation referred to as the FACE or Public Health Assessment Study for the evaluation of health risk, basically, to justify specifying Kratom and its major alkaloids, metraginin and 7-hydroxymetraginin, as opioids. And this classification, based on this, using this computational model alone, is not sound science and fails to consider the additional scientific literature that has been published over the past 5 to 10 years that reported a distinct difference in how these compounds present in Kratom interact with the same opioid receptors in the brain. In isolated receptors, animals alike, these alkaloids presented with different effects from that of the classical opioids like morphine or heroin. And therefore, we cannot just, based on the FDA FACE model, make a judgment that these compounds will lead to the same effects as morphine and heroin, and therefore the animal studies and receptor studies should be also considered based on the literature survey. And in addition, the animals have shown that there's no potential for fatal respiratory depression, even at higher doses. The FDA has, in addition, in its February 2018 release, stated that Kratom has been related to the cause of death in 44 instances. And this cannot be reasonably supported by scientific or medical standards. Unlike overdose deaths that are rightly attributed to classical opioids, which have been shown to reliably cause respiratory depression and death at high doses, the fatalities that the FDA lists as having been associated with Kratom include deaths with a wide variety of apparent causes in people suffering from various diseases that also involved a variety of other substances that were taken together with Kratom. And this allows us to not conclusively determine if Kratom was actually the causative agent that caused the death. Therefore, linking Kratom to these deaths directly, the FDA claims, is not sound scientific standard and a medical standard for making this claim. It is our belief that the FDA should use all available literature in classifying Kratom and its alkaloids as opioids. We believe that this is a misnomer, and further investigation should be allowed, and therefore potentially allowing placement of Kratom and its alkaloids into the controlled substances Schedule 1 would hinder that research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, that was Oliver Grundmann, PhD, Clinical Associate Professor, College of Pharmacy at the University of Florida. Let's move to our third speaker, Paula N. Brown, PhD, Director of Applied Research, BC Institute of Technology, Canada Research Chair in Phytoanalytics, and Adjunct Professor of Biology at the University of British Columbia. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. So what we're talking about today is Mitragyna speciosa, often referred to as kratom. And it's a botanical that has a very long history of use in Southeast Asia and more recently in North America. Traditionally, kratom leaves have been used for increasing energy, to relieve stress, and or minor aches and pains, overall to improve quality of life, predominantly amongst the working class. I have worked through my research to support the industry in compliance with good manufacturing practices, both in Canada for natural health products and the U.S. for dietary supplements for close to 2 decades. So when the FDA first issued an import alert stating that kratom is a botanical that qualifies as a dietary ingredient under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, I was encouraged because regardless of whether we consider it a dietary ingredient or new dietary ingredient, it really puts the focus on compliance with good manufacturing practices. And it is through compliance with good manufacturing practices that we're able to ensure that the public has access to products that are not adulterated, and that's whether it's food or dietary supplements. And there is incidences of adulteration in many areas of food and dietary supplements, and kratom is no exception. And so it's very important that we have products that are not adulterated, whether it be with opioids or spiked with concentrated amounts of specific alkaloids like mitragynine or 7-hydroxymitragynine that are not consistent with the level typically found in leaves, and certainly not with historical products, and that these products are tested to meet purity specifications as per good manufacturing practices. For example, microbial contamination that's been in the news lately. So my position is that I agree with the FDA that these concerns should be eliminated. And what we need, though, is for a kratom product regulatory standard that would protect both the kratom manufacturers and absolutely the consumers. The scheduling of kratom, my largest concern is that it would foster an illicit and dangerous marketplace. The FDA could protect the American public by appropriate regulation of kratom, and I think that the Office of Dietary Supplements has been working towards this, and this could provide consumers and health professionals with the information they need to help guide safe use and ensure lawfully marketed products are available to the consumers. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, that was Paula N. Brown, PhD, Director of Applied Research, BC Institute of Technology, Canada Research Chair, Phytoanalytics, and Adjunct Professor of Biology, University of British Columbia. So let's go to our fourth and final speaker, Dr. Jack Henningfield, Vice President of Research, Health Policy, and Abuse Liability at Pinney Associates, and also Adjunct Professor of Behavioral Biology, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment. As mentioned, none of us are receiving compensation for this call. I would like to disclose that I consult the American Kratom Association on the health and science effects and regulatory pathways for kratom. I'd like to mention that began with pro bono support of their effort to reverse DEA's scheduling proposal in August of 2016. And me and my team did that because we felt DEA was wrong on the science and it would create a public health problem with the ban, because we knew at that point that kratom was being used by many people in place of opioids. My history and work and the work of my colleagues at Pinney Associates has very much been focused on addiction and safer medicines. So we were greatly concerned. We were surprised and pleased that DEA actually reversed itself and passed it to FDA. And it was my hope that FDA would look at the science and consider the public health and find a regulatory pathway that helps protect public health. Because this is not something new. This is something that's been around for decades, and kratom is being used by several million people. There are various estimates, but 3 to 5 million people as we sit here. There are 4 different surveys, as you have heard, concerning kratom use. we know nothing. There's a lot of research, as you've heard, that goes back decades in Southeast Asia. Some of the really exciting research is going on today in the United States, and that's looking at the molecules in kratom, like mitragynines, as potential models for safer medicines of the future. But we shouldn't hope that this is going to happen quickly. That will take research, and you may know that it takes about 10 years on average and $2.5 billion to develop a new drug. So banning kratom and hoping that the molecules will be magically turned into medicines in the near term is not realistic. So how do we go forward? And that's a lot of my focus. First, I think it's important to recognize that none of us on this call think the status quo is fine or that FDA should do nothing. Ironically, there is only one agency that can do what needs to be done to serve public health, including kratom users now and in the futures. That is FDA. And in fact, some of the very problems that FDA has expressed concern about can only be addressed by FDA. If FDA walks away by supporting a ban, then problems like adulterated products, erratic labeling and contents will get worse because the illicit marketing will take over. There are 4 surveys, more than 20,000 testimonials to FDA and DEA that show that most kratom users like the choices that they have in the lawful market, and they are scared to death of losing the lawful market. And they are right to be afraid of losing the lawful market because the black market is a very scary thing. So I hope FDA will not walk away from this because it will create a problem that does not currently exist. A couple of other things. What can FDA do? Well, the American Kratom Association, other organizations, I think responsible manufacturers, they all support FDA regulation that sets standards for product purity. Then consumers will have the same assurance that they have with other dietary supplements, that their products are pure, and if that there are products that have problems, the FDA can remove them. FDA doesn't ban green onions because there are some contaminated green onions. It addresses the problem. FDA can set standards for what goes into manufactured products. It can work with manufacturers on what claims should be allowed on labeling. So FDA has an enormous range of tools that I think all of us would love to see exerted. Finally, and this is what really drives my efforts in this area, is that the 4 surveys show that many kratom users are using it as a lifeline away from opioids. Now, that's not most kratom users. Most are using it. Some use it in place of coffee as a focusing, alerting substance in the morning and during the day. Others use it for minor anxiety and depression, and for them, it works. That doesn't mean it's an approved drug. It just means that there are many people that have found that this is helpful to them. But what is really scary is that there are many people, and we don't know if it's thousands or tens of thousands. FDA could help find out with bigger surveys, but there are many people that are using kratom as a lifeline away from opioids, whether the opioids were used because they were addicted or whether the opioids were used for pain and they didn't want to use the opioids. And all of us who work in addiction know what happens when you remove the lifeline that a person says is keeping them off drugs. You put them at serious risk of going back to drugs. Real opioids kill more than 100 people, and real opioids kill very reliably. They stop respiration. Kratom does not act like an opioid in that sense. And I'll use a technical term, the hodgepodge of deaths that FDA has put together includes 9 deaths from Sweden, of all places, that were actually attributed by the Swedes as due to the desmethyl tramadol. In other words, a tramadol related substance that actually is lethal. It includes many other bizarre things. So this doesn't mean that kratom is absolutely safe. Nothing's absolutely safe. But the deaths that FDA has put together not meet the standards for what CDC reports when it talks about opioid deaths. So I hope that FDA will come up to speed on the science. I hope it will work with the people that are manufacturing kratom and the consumer organizations and public health experts. We need FDA to exert its role to protect public health and help us go forward with more research, balanced regulation, and continued access to kratom for the millions of users that are already using it and benefiting. Thank you.
Again, that was Dr. Jack Henningfield, Vice President of Research, Health Policy, and Abuse Liability at Pinney Associates, and Adjunct Professor of Behavioral Biology, Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And that takes us to the Q&A portion of the call, and I want to emphasize the Q&A period is for the media only. And I'm going to invite the operator back on to explain once again how members of the media can ask a question. Operator?
At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press star then 1 on your touch-tone phone. If you decide to withdraw your question, please press star then 2 to remove yourself from the list. Please limit yourself to one question and a single follow-up. If you need to ask an additional question, please know that you may press star 1 to rejoin the queue.
All right, thanks, operator. And before we dig into the questions, I just want to make sure that folks listening know how to connect with any of the speakers or get needed information following the call. You can contact Max Carlin at 703-276-3255. Again, that's 703-276-3255. You can also refer to the bit.ly link at the bottom of the news release that's probably in your inboxes already. There's the release, and that's where the audio recording of today's news event will be living. If you didn't get that release, you can contact Max Carlin. Operator, let's go ahead and start off with our first question.
The first question comes from Malcolm Spicer with Informa. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Good day, everybody. One question is about kratom being a new dietary ingredient. Dr. Brown pointed out several years ago when the FDA announced import alerts that the alerts identify kratom and its constituents, I guess, as a new dietary ingredient, which would need a notification to FDA before being made available in the U.S. And then after kind of getting away from that and speaking only about kratom's alleged problems, FDA is now talking about kratom being an NDI and needing a notification. What does the industry do about that? One, is it an NDI? And two, how can you get okay with a notification to FDA for kratom?
A quick response from Henningfield, and Paula is probably one of the national experts on this, but there's no question that kratom has been used for several decades, probably brought over by Southeast Asians by the 1980s, and may very well qualify as an old dietary ingredient. And this was discussed at an FDA hearing. The problem is that we don't have the kinds of documentation from the 80s that we do now. And so that means that it is in an area where FDA has the tools to regulate natural products, to regulate manufactured products. And my understanding was that it was doing just that. Paula, you're the real expert on how that works.
Yeah, so you're right. Under the import alert, they did state that kratom is a botanical that qualifies as a dietary ingredient. And then they further stated that they considered kratom as a new dietary ingredient because they were unaware of evidence of it being in the marketplace prior to 1994 as per the Dietary Supplement Education Act, Health and Education Act. And that's true. So it puts the industry in an interesting position with respect to dietary supplements, and this is true not just for kratom, but for a lot of ingredients where it's difficult to document that it was marketed as a dietary supplement prior to say. So really, I think from my position, the importance of compliance. So if you have evidence to support it as being as a part of the food supply, and exempt from the regulation, or as being marketed as a dietary supplement, then I encourage you to put that forward to the FDA. If FDA feels strongly that it's a new dietary ingredient and feels that your evidence is insufficient, then you should file a new dietary ingredient notification as per the guidance document. And I don't think that's necessarily unachievable. Right? I mean, it under the new dietary ingredient notification system, it is just a notification system. It's not a pre-market approval system. And you have to follow just as you would for a dietary ingredient that's an old dietary ingredient. You need to set specifications for identity, for purity, for content. And to my mind, that any responsible manufacturer should be doing that, ensuring that there's no deleterious substances in their materials. I do think that the import alert did put pressure on the marketplace, though. It limited access to high-quality raw materials and made, I think, it much more difficult or less attractive to responsible manufacturers and to continue to supply the demanded materials to the marketplace.
I see. In fact, on FDA's NDI notification database, there are two notifications that were filed for kratom. Both have not been accepted as showing, one as showing either identity or safety for the intended use, and the other safety for the intended use.
I think it's evident that FDA's commissioner's office has not been working with the dietary supplements group, because the dietary supplements group would certainly have access to a lot of the data that are public that address the safety, that show that kratom and its mitragynines are not like narcotic-like opioids. But I think all of us that work in the dietary area know that when FDA is getting into a new area, it's learning itself, it's coming up to speed, and it's pretty common for it to ask manufacturers. As you know, it doesn't disapprove, it doesn't approve. It says, we want more, and that's pretty common. And I would hate to see that process be shut down, because through that process, that's how FDA learns, and that's how it develops standards for the products that are out there with people by working with manufacturers. That's a healthy process.
Well, certainly, and then I should say that one of the earlier of those two filings was not very strong, whereas the second one not only did it establish identity, I didn't see how FDA didn't, how I should say, how it would question the evidence on safety for the intended use. So there's that. Also, I actually had not thought about the potentially adulterated kratom products being part of being in the marketplace. Is there some thought by you four, as well as others in the industry, that perhaps in the reported deaths that certainly are not directly linked to kratom, nonetheless, the kratom used in those cases, in those unfortunate cases, could have been adulterated?
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you that in my own research lab, I certainly have surveyed products in the marketplace and found synthetic opioids in kratom materials. It's out there. I mean, but that's why GMP and FDA's role is so important. It's no different. Dating all the way back to 2001, I published finding diethylstilbestrol and warfarin in a herbal supplement. So it's out there. It happens. And again, that's why regulatory compliance is so very important. There are adulterated products in this marketplace, and it's very difficult to know what role that could have played in some of their case studies, because the case studies are very insufficient with respect to the information. And, I think it would be great if materials were acquired and tested like they typically would when you were investigating an adverse event.
The next
Operator, let's go to our next question.
The next question comes from Gabe Kara with Gizmodo. Please go ahead.
Hi, yes. So it's actually Ed, but yeah, thanks anyhow. I was wondering, I think you sort of answered it a bit, but what is sort of the research that we need that would get the FDA to want to stand down from what it seems like is a very, very harsh stance against the drug.
I'll just make one comment and then maybe turn it over to Mark or Jack. I think that there's two different things here. You have traditional formulations that have been used for sort of appropriate dietary supplement type claims, and that needs to have a standard and regulatory compliance. And then you have the potential therapeutic benefits that would be a different area of research that needs to be more thoroughly investigated. And I would put that back to my colleagues to further discuss.
This is Mark Swager. I think what we need to see in terms of the second aim is randomized controlled trials and longitudinal studies to determine whether there are more subtle long-term health risks associated with kratom. At this point, that evidence is just not available.
And that's a good point, because when product is available and regulated, FDA can be collecting data and generating data. When it shuts down legitimate access, it shuts down research. But in terms of what key research, my personal view when I saw Dr. Grunman's study is that was the blockbuster, because that looked at close to 10,000 people and showed that Houston, we've got a problem. We've got people that are using kratom right now that are benefiting from it, telling us a lot. And if you ban it, Houston, we've got a serious problem. 3 surveys followed up on that. And one of them was by my colleagues at Hopkins, a NIDA-supported survey. One of them was a survey, the fourth I did, my colleagues did, supported by the American Kratom Association, which we proposed to them to follow up on the opioid connection. I am stunned that FDA seems to be ignoring the reality of people who are using kratom who will be put at risk of going back to opioids and other substances if it's banned. I don't understand that.
I would like to further point out that, this is Paula. I'd like to further point out that the history of safe use is based on traditional use of the product, right? So, you're talking about particular levels of alkaloids that are going to be in line with what you find in the leaf naturally in the traditional preparations that people have used, similarly like a tea, and that's different in terms of dosing when you're talking necessarily about a therapeutic use. And there's other precedents, specifications for identity, purity, and content. You consider yohimbine, which is a drug. There's limits to how much yohimbine you have in yohimbe bark, but yohimbe bark is a dietary ingredient found in herbal medicine for centuries.
So, Oliver, in regards to the current knowledge that we have knowledge how differential the alkaloids, tragenin and other alkaloids in kratom, interact with the opioid receptors. We already have that knowledge, and FDA seems to ignore what the literature already provides. So when it comes to that difference in scientific opinion, not even a difference necessarily, but really what FDA seems to be ignoring what the science tells us already, we have a new class of drugs that act differently on opioid receptors, distinctly different on opioid receptors, that do not come with a potential for respiratory depression. And that actually is a key difference that can be a lifesaver for people that are currently taking opioid medication. Kratom has been shown to be an analgesic, provide pain relief without causing respiratory depression. So if we schedule it and place it in Schedule 1, we prevent that research. We really stymie that research, as Dr. Henningsville pointed out. So that is for therapeutic uses one thing we need to look into. And FDA, by classifying kratom and its alkaloids basically push it into the direction of being classified into Schedule 1. That is counterproductive. On the other side, the classical use or the traditional use of kratom and the use it is now used as a dietary supplement, like Dr. Henningfield pointed out, 3 to 5 million or even more users just in the United States alone, is very different from a classical, what we might perceive as a classical app user. The demographics are very different from that, from the survey that I conducted last year or 2 years ago, where we had over 8,000 responses. And it's very different demographic. It's middle-class income people, and the rate of people that reported negative effects, adverse effects, is significantly lower. It's in the range of 0.006 to 5% that needed medical attention with the use of kratom. So we're looking at a very different population, very different incidences of adverse effects. So this needs to be further investigated. And as Dr. Swagger also pointed out, what are the long-term effects? So some people who have been taking this survey have been taking kratom for 5 years, maybe even 10 years, and they have not seen increase in doses. So they did see actually an abuse liability or a dependence on kratom. So I think that needs to be further investigated, definitely. Thank you.
Great. Operator, let's go to our next question.
The next question comes from Josh Long with Natural Products Insider. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the call today. I had a question about DEA. So the FDA says it's completed a comprehensive scientific and medical evaluation of the compounds found in kratom. That was done at DEA's request, as everyone probably recalls. And the FDA says it's working with its partners at DEA as they further evaluate these compounds and as DEA considers whether and how they should be scheduled. So I guess it's possible that FDA has already recommended to DEA that kratom be scheduled as a drug under the CSA. Shouldn't you all be talking to the DEA? That's my question.
Well, this is Henningfield. I live in that regulatory world because a lot of my work is developing opioid medicines and their scheduling. And in fact, a group of us and I believe about 5 more widely recognized scientists wrote a letter to DEA and to the White House on this very issue. And that's publicly available. I'm the first author on it. You can find it easily on the internet. So you can see our plea to DEA and the White House. But I think DEA needs help. I think that the reason that we're doing this today is because the word has to get out. There has to be pressure. DEA did not just spontaneously reverse itself in September of 2016. It reversed itself when senators and congressmen and more than 20,000 kratom users commented. It's important to get the science out and get the public health out. But DEA, the good thing is, isn't under a timeline on this product. I hope that DEA will be very careful. I believe that DEA is well aware of the fact, and this is not speculation, the fact that there are kratom users who are off of opioids. FDA seemed to have ignored that. I think DEA may understand that better, and I hope DEA will do the right thing. But this is a very scary time if you care about the opioid crisis and the people that are, for whom kratom is a lifeline.
Great. And just to make sure that all the reporters on the line have a chance to pose their questions, before we get into our next question, I'm going to bring the operator back on to repeat how members of the media can pose a question. Operator?
As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, you may press star, then 1 on your touch-tone phone. To remove yourself from the queue, you can press star, then 2. Again, it is star 1 to ask a question.
Thank you, operator, and let's proceed to the next question in line.
The next question is a follow-up from Malcolm Spicer with Informa. Please go ahead.
Thank you again. Circling back to purity standards for kratom ingredients, if I understood Dr. Henningfield's comment, it was that to expect or to suggest FDA establish the standards. As far as I understand, though, when it comes to dietary supplement ingredients, those standards are FDA expects the industry to develop, and then FDA, of course, says whether the standards are okay or not. Perhaps with the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, that can be done, or perhaps it's already been done.
Hi. Yeah, this is Paul. So the onus is on manufacturers to set specifications for their products. They are required to set specifications, as you know, for identity, purity, and content. There are examples where limits with respect to content have been set, as I mentioned earlier, for example, yohimbine and yohimbe bark. So I think if there was acknowledgement of kratom as a dietary ingredient, it actually would be the manufacturer's responsibility to set those specifications. At the same time, if the specifications that they set do not reflect an appropriate safe use, then absolutely the FDA can step in. Certainly under the new dietary ingredient notification system, you'd be providing that evidence that you have a reasonable assertion that your product is safe based on the specifications that you have set.
Thank you. Do you know whether the U.S. Pharmacopoeia has a standard for kratom?
I can actually answer that. I sit on the USP expert committee for dietary supplements and and traditional medicine. So, no, they do not as yet.
Okay, thank you.
But the point is, FDA has an enormous range of tools that it can bring to bear, and it can learn, it can work with manufacturers and marketers. It's incredible the resources that it has that can be helpful to public health and help kratom users. If it walks away, it kicks the ball to the black market.
Okay, thank you. Operator, do we have any further questions at this time?
There are no more questioners in the queue.
Okay, well, thank you. I know some of the folks are going to want to take their questions off the call or do interviews. So to connect with any of the speakers you're hearing from today or to get further information about the news conference, just contact Max Carlin at 703-276-3255. Again, that's 703-276-3255. And we've got a landing page for the different content. There will be a streaming audio replay of this news event available online at about 4 p.m. Eastern. It'll be at a bit.ly link, bit.ly/Kratom Science. Kratom Science, all one word. And that bit.ly is linked on the news release that you should have in your inbox by now. Excuse me. If you haven't received it yet, just contact Max Carlin. We thank everybody for joining us today, and that concludes today's news event.